Well, we've reached noon, and I'm sure people will continue to be joining us. But in the interest of timekeeping, and I know having such a broad geographical spread, people from around the world, it probably is a good idea to stick as closely as possible to time. So I'd like to welcome you all here. What a wonderful event, and what a good way of brightening up what was quite a grim January around the globe, I think, especially here in the UK and in much of Northern Europe and the Northern Hemisphere. But I'd like to start off by handing over to Anna Eavis, who's the curatorial director here at English Heritage, who will be formally welcoming you to this event. Of course, Rievaulx is in the care of English Heritage, so I'll shut up and hand you over to Anna.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everybody, those that I can see and those I can't see, although I can see that there are quite a lot of you. Welcome. As Michael said, English Heritage is the charity responsible for looking after over 420 historic sites in England on behalf of the state. And of course, Rievaulx Abbey is one of them. Rievaulx, which is a site enjoyed by thousands of visitors every year because of its beauty and tranquility as well as its history, has actually been in the care of the nation for just over 100 years. And it's fair to say that in that century, our approach to the conservation and management and presentation of our historic sites has evolved. And Rievaulx is no exception to this. And of course, it's evolved largely due to the efforts of many scholars, past and present, a lot of whom are in the audience today and speaking, and as well as past members of staff of English Heritage and its predecessors. One of the ways in which our approach to presenting our sites has evolved, particularly I would say in the last couple of decades, is that there is an increased interest on our part and on the part of our visitors in understanding more about those people whose lives touched the monuments that we care for. And of course, at Rievaulx, the man of the moment is Aelred, and a man who was, by all accounts, an inspirational monastic leader, a great builder, of course, which is very important for us, a great preacher, writer, diplomat, a man who was loved by many and also venerated as a saint. And so what we're hoping to do over the next couple of days in this great gathering of scholars and interested parties is actually to seek to explore Aelred's significance from all those perspectives. And we'll also be considering his place today as an important figure for LGBTQ Christians. So there's going to be a round table at the end of the conference tomorrow. The conference was the idea of my colleague, Dr. Michael Carter, who I think is probably known to you all. And I'd like to thank him very much for all his work in shaping this and organising the conference. Of course, we originally envisaged that it would take place in person and that it would include the all-important opportunity to visit Rievaulx, where we will be installing a new trail about Aelred. But that, of course, is not possible due to the COVID pandemic, and Rievaulx, I'm sorry to say, is closed at the moment. So we're very grateful indeed to the BAA for joining with us, partnering with us on this event and enabling us to host it in this way. And I would absolutely concur with Michael that in the circumstances, this actually seems like a bit of a beacon. It's a wonderful way to be brightening up a dreary January week amid all the gloom by considering this very uplifting person, Aelred. Finally, I would like to particularly acknowledge, I've talked about the many, many scholars who've contributed to our understanding of Rievaulx and Aelred. I'd like to particularly acknowledge the contribution of Peter Fergusson and of Marsha Dutton in advancing our understanding of Aelred. They're both speaking later, I'm delighted to say, but this conference is very much a tribute to their scholarship, and I'd like to dedicate it to them. So on that note, I will hand back to Michael, and best wishes to you all, and I hope you all will enjoy what looks like being a really interesting couple of sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for the introduction and welcome. And and I endorse those warm comments and completely justified comments about Peter and Marsha. We know so much about Rievaulx and Aelred because of their dedicated scholarship for more years probably than they care to remember. And one of the reasons I think that Rievaulx is understood as this great monument to the human spirit, and why Aelred shines through in this dark January as such a wonderful person, is largely thanks to their scholarship. And also we'll be hearing from so many other people in this conference who have contributed to Aelred studies. And it was one of the, having to hold this online in, I deliberately timed it so it would coincide with Aelred's feast day, and which falls on the 12th of the anniversary of his death in 1167. So anyway, we're a little bit ahead of time, but I think, gosh, how many times can you say that in a conference? We're a little bit ahead of time. But I think without further ado, rather than listening to me rabbit on any further, I'm going to hand over to Janet Burton. And Janet is a professor of medieval history at the University of Wales, Lampeter. And she's director of the Monastic Wales project with Karen Stuber. And with Karen is editor of a journal, which I heartily endorse you read and, if possible, subscribe to if you're a librarian, the Journal of Medieval Monastic Studies. Now, she's written extensively on the Cistercian order, and her book, The Monastic Order in Yorkshire up to 1215, is a mainstay of monastic studies. So many, likewise, so many of her articles. And it is brilliant that we're starting with Janet to set the scene about what Northern England was like in terms of monastic settlement when Rievaulx is first founded. And also, so much of what shines through about Aelred is friendship and generosity, both of which Janet has in absolute abundance. And if we were in an auditorium now, I think there'd be rapturous applause for Janet, but without embarrassing her any further, I'll hand over to her now for her paper. Thank you very much, Janet, for participating.
Well, thank you, Michael, for that introduction and for inviting me to give this opening paper, which, as you've indicated, is really intended to provide a context for the papers that follow. So I'm now going to share my screen. I hope this works. Yes, good. Well, I thought I might begin by asking what sort of monastic environment it was into which the Cistercians arrived in the early 1130s. Well, for the 60 years or so before the foundation of the first Cistercian house in the north, which was, of course, Rievaulx, the monastic footprint in the north had been growing steadily. The landscape was dominated by 4 large Benedictine houses. The Cathedral Priory of Durham ruled supreme north of the Tees, with its dependencies either side of the Scottish border. The Royal Foundation at Selby was prospering, although it had been overtaken in prestige by the Abbey of St. Mary's, York, made rich and powerful through royal sponsorship and benefactions from the elite of society. There were baronial foundations at Whitby and the Cluniac House of Pontefract, and by 1130 the Augustinian canons had made a number of foundations, including Nostell, Gisborough and Kirkham. The Reformed orders had made footfalls at Savignac Furness and north of the border with Scotland at Turonensian Selkirk. The monastic north then was well populated, but not as densely as other areas into which the Cistercians were to spread. A number of these established houses in the north were to feel the impact of the Cistercian plantation to a greater or lesser extent, no more so than at St Mary's Abbey, York, where turbulent events led to the foundation of Fountains Abbey just a few months after Rievaulx. Now, the story of the coming of the Cistercians to the north demonstrates a rich web of association, and it's some aspects of this that I'd like briefly to explore. Okay. So when do we detect the coming of the Cistercians to the north? Well, the Cistercian General Chapter, in its zeal for order, precedence and ritual, assigned a date of March 1132 to the foundation of the earliest northern Cistercian house at Rievaulx. Yet, without even raising the question of what marked a formal foundation, which of the many steps involved in the process of foundation indicated the beginning of a religious community, I think we can be sure that 1132 marked an end as well as a beginning. It was the culmination of a series of negotiations. In the fullness of time, the General Chapter, through legislation, codified the necessary steps for making a new foundation: inspection of a site, investigation of the proposed material support for a new community, the obtaining of consents and permissions. Now, quite how precisely these were laid down by 1130, we cannot be certain. But we can be sure not only that the foundation of Rievaulx was the result of complex negotiations, but also that the Cistercian order was already known in the north even before the first footfall was planned. It was probably in the late 1120s that Bernard, Abbot of Clairvaux, wrote to Henry Murdoch, a master of the schools in York. Bernard's secretary of some years' standing was another Yorkshireman, William, very probably the William who, along with Evo, was mentioned at the end of this letter, and the both of them were clearly known to Henry Murdoch. This was a recruiting letter, and this extract, which I hope you can see all of it, will give a flavour of Bernard's approach, and in this case, his appeal to the scholar to abandon the schools in favour of the monastery. I'm not going to read it all, but I just point you to phrases such as, "You will find much more labouring among the woods than you ever will among books. Woods and stones will teach you what you can never hear from any master." So this is Bernard trying to persuade the scholar to abandon the schools and enter the Cistercian life. Bernard also wrote 2 letters to Thomas, provost of the important church of Beverley, urging him to fulfil his promise to enter the Cistercian life at Clairvaux. Now, Thomas did not heed Bernard's call, but Henry Murdoch did. He left York to become a monk at Clairvaux, and after a short time moved to be abbot of a daughter house at Vauclair. And it was from there that he returned to Yorkshire to become abbot of Fountains, and in 1147, the first Cistercian archbishop in England. Another English recruit was Philip, a canon of Lincoln, the subject of a letter to Bishop Alexander of Lincoln, applauding Philip's decision to enter Clairvaux. And to look again at Bernard's rhetoric gives an insight into the ways in which the Cistercian message was presented and its response. Again, I'll not read this extract, but I wanted to put it up to give you again an idea of the way in which Bernard was consciously promoting the Cistercian way of life. it makes sense of this extract to know that Philip had been on a journey to Jerusalem when he arrived at Clairvaux, because here Bernard identifies Clairvaux with Jerusalem. And this, if you want to know, is Clairvaux. She is Jerusalem. And Bishop Alexander indeed went on to found a Cistercian house at Haverham and to be a supporter of Aelred in his first abbatial career at the Abbey of Rievaulx within Alexander's diocese. So I think it is important to set the foundation of Rievaulx in this context of contacts already established in the north. It was an episcopal colleague of Alexander who was to be most intimately involved in bringing the Cistercians to the north, and that was Archbishop Thurston of York. Appointed as a royal nominee in 1114, the early years of his career were deeply affected by the ongoing dispute between Canterbury and York over the question of primacy, which led to Thurston's exile from England and his absence from his see until 1121. Yet in many ways this was a fruitful period, especially from 1119, for it was then that Thurston attached himself to the entourage of Pope Calixtus II. This broadened his experience of continental, ecclesiastical and cultural developments, and indeed brought him into first-hand knowledge of the Cistercians. Was, for instance, with Calixtus at Saulieu in 1119, when the Pope ratified the Cistercian constitution. Already a conscientious promoter of holy vocations, to use Donald Nicholls' phrase, it was surely no time before the Cistercians would be welcomed into Thurston's diocese. It was not Thurston alone, however, who was important. What was significant was the tight network of which he was a part. Pivotal to the plans to make a Cistercian plantation in the north was St. Bernard himself. And this is part of that very famous letter to Henry I of England. In your land there is an outpost of my lord and your lord, an outpost which he has preferred to die for rather than to lose. I have proposed to occupy it, and I am sending men from my army who will, if it is not displeasing to you, claim it, recover it, and restore it with a strong hand. For this purpose, I have sent ahead these men who now stand before you to reconnoitre. They will investigate the situation carefully and report back to me faithfully. And Bernard concludes by requesting, or perhaps ordering, Henry's compliance and his cooperation in facilitating the coming of the Cistercians. Now here Bernard is employing the military language and metaphors so often used to describe the monastic order, and terms such as vassal, which would have resonated with a medieval king. No place is actually named, just Praeda, the spoils of war. But the context in which this letter survives, the first part of the 13th century narrative of the foundation of Fountains Abbey, makes clear that the men standing before the king was the advanced party of a convent to be sent from Clairvaux to colonize the north. The foundation charter of Rievaulx, which is probably a composite document, adds further names to this network. And I've given you here at the beginning and the end. The charter begins in the name of the Holy and Indivisible Trinity, world respect to all the sons of Holy Mother Church, greetings. May you all know that I have given and conceded, with the consent of Henry, King of the English, on the advice of my wife, Adelina, to God and the Church of St. Mary of Rievaulx into the hand of Abbot William. And it ends, I, Walter, have founded this Abbey of Rievaulx on the advice and with the consent of Thurstan, Archbishop of York, and also with the consent and advice of Henry, King of the English. The Lord Pope Innocent has confirmed all these things by apostolic authority. Abbot William was that same Yorkshireman who had been Bernard's secretary, and now he returned to the land of his birth to carry the Cistercian message home. For the rest, we have mention of a king, an archbishop, a pope, and a leading baron, Walter Especk, who settled the Cistercians just a few miles from his castle of Helmsley. Now, there is no mention here of Bernard, although the memorial of benefactions entered into the cartularia section headed Iste sunt possessiones records that the initial grant was made to Bernard. So at the beginning, 9 carucates of land were given to the Blessed Bernard, Abbot of Clairvaux, for the foundation of a monastery, and giving the date of 1131. And this dates from somewhere between 1174, and although Bernard isn't mentioned in the foundation charter, the role of Bernard was clearly still in the corporate memory of the abbey. But why 1131, 1132, and not before? Well, in 1131, shortly after Bernard had persuaded most Western rulers to accept Innocent II as the rightful pope, Innocent and Henry met at Chartres. More tellingly, they met again in May, this time in Rouen. And in the Pope's entourage was Bernard, Abbot of Clairvaux. And this encounter would have provided ample opportunity to plan the extension of Clairvaux's influence into England and into the north, which would have furnished fertile land for Cistercian growth. Another cog in this network of association and patronage was David I, King of the Scots. The border between England and David's realm was a political rather than a cultural one. David was an English earl, a familiar at the court of King Henry I, and a man of broad ecclesiastical interests. Like Henry, he was a keen patron of the Augustinian canons, and he was founder of one of the first reformed houses outside France at Selkirk. We know that on Henry I's death in 1135, David immediately threw in his lot with his niece, the Empress Matilda, and seized the opportunity to drive the political border south. How long these ambitions had been nurtured is not recorded, but we may suggest that his interest in Rievaulx in particular may have been stimulated by a desire to cultivate close relations with the north and establish religious, particularly monastic bonds. According to Walter Daniel, it was as Aelred was returning from a mission from King David to Archbishop Thurston that he turned aside and, renouncing the world, entered Rievaulx. Marsha Dutton has shown convincingly that this hagiographical trope, the sudden and unexpected conversion, masks a purposeful journey, a decision already taken to become a Cistercian, and one that was backed by powerful supporters, David and Thurston. Nor did David lose time in creating further monastic bonds between northern England and southern Scotland, with the foundation of Melrose Abbey from Rievaulx in 1136, just 4 years after the foundation of Rievaulx itself. It was placed under the leadership of his stepson Waldef, whom Aelred knew well. Waldef, who had left Scotland to become an Augustinian canon, first at Nostell and then at Kirkham, where he ruled as prior until his decision to take the Cistercian habit. Kirkham had been founded by Walter Speck, so we see yet more connections. And after his conversion, Waldeck spent some time at Walter Speck's second Cistercian foundation at Warden before returning to Scotland. The passage of the Clairvaux monks to Rievaulx was famously the inspiration for a movement towards reform at the rich and powerful Benedictine Abbey at York. And in this drama, we find many of the same actors. Thurston, who attempted mediation and then took the refugee monks of St. Mary's into his care and provided them with a site for their abbey. And Bernard, whom the monks approached to ask to be accepted into the Cistercian order as a daughter house of Clairvaux. And we may suppose that William of Rievaulx played his part. In a remarkable letter, Bernard asked David, King of Scots, to show the same generosity to the infant monastery of Fountains as he had to Rievaulx. And here you can see part of his letter, explaining that the brothers at Rievaulx had been the first to experience the effect of David's mercy, and asking for help for brothers in the same neighbourhood who have lately joined us. Now, if we can take that reference to the monks who have lately joined us literally, then David's support, in whatever form it took, accompanies, perhaps even predated Aelred's formal entry into Rievaulx. Now, it has been suggested that this letter is slightly later, that it might refer to the foundation of Melrose in 1136. I think I incline to the earlier date, but whichever it is, the communication among Bernard, Thurston, and David was highly influential in the Cistercian settlement. Just a few words then by way of conclusion. Often the written sources do not allow us to describe the foundation of a Cistercian monastery in any terms other than the dispatch of a group of monks from an existing monastery to found a new one, usually at the request of a lay patron. The story of the coming of the Cistercians to the north shows us so much more than this. It shows us the appeal of the Cistercian way of life to recruits and patrons alike. It tells us of the proactive nature of Cistercian expansion. It demonstrates the impact of the coming of the Cistercians to the north on the established monastic order. And above all, it shows the importance of networks, networks among royalty, the episcopate, the baronage, and the monastic world, and the vibrancy of those contacts. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure rapturous applause for Gemma there for her excellent start to this conference. And this is really to set the scene, this first session. And I should have said that we're going to be taking questions at the end, and if you could type them into the Q&A box, and I'll be reading them out. We've had the historical context, and we're now going to move on to the architectural context. And who better to be doing it than Stuart Harrison, who I'm sure will be familiar to so many people. And Stuart's director of Rievaulx Archaeological Services, or Rievaulx Archaeology Service, and he's also the cathedral archaeologist to York Minster. And he's worked with English heritage for decades. And, anybody who visits an English heritage monastic site is going to be in some way or another in his debt for the interpretation that's provided there. And he's also the co-author with Peter on a monumental work on Rievaulx Abbey, published in 1999 by Yale University Press, which will really going to stand the test of time as the standard reference work on the monastery. Anyway, he's contributing to all sorts of things, but he's contributing to us today. So without further ado, I will hand over to Stuart.
Thank you, Michael. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm going to go to share screen. I hope it works. Here we go. I'm not sure this is working.
Oh dear.
It's opened up. Allow the apps below to record. Oh, I don't know what it's doing here.
Stuart, do you have your PowerPoint open on your desktop?
Do I have what?
Do you have your PowerPoint open
I do,
on your
yes, I
desktop?
have it, yeah.
Okay, and then when you're hitting the green share screen button, it doesn't give you the PowerPoint as an option?
I'll just go back to see where I am. I've sort of lost it now. I've lost the Zoom. This is not good. Zoom has only just been installed on this computer today, so it's not behaving, I'm afraid. Ah, hang on. Right here, I'll try share screen again. Keynote unknown. It's when I try to go to allow share screen, it comes up with allow Zoom to share your screen, and then it says open system preferences.
Yeah, okay, so
And
does
then
it give you a link
to
open the system preferences?
This is mad. We need to get this to share screen somehow. Anybody any ideas?
I'm trying to look it up. I think probably because it is new to your computer, you've not gone through it. So you said allow, right?
Yes, but then it just comes up with the preferences.
Okay.
If I go share screen, it comes up with the various things. And
Are you on a Mac or a PC?
I clicked a keynote unknown and went to share. Or if I go to desktop one, it does the same thing. It comes up with a box saying allow Zoom to share your screen and open system preferences. Security and privacy to grant access.
Security, okay.
Hang on, let me see. There's nothing for security and privacy there. Oh, privacy. Yes. Hang on, I think I've got it. Yeah. See if this works now. I've clicked on it, so let's try. Ah.
Hey.
Does that come up?
Yes.
Look, the screen has come up, and I can see a presentation behind it. Yeah.
Is that it there?
That's a round of applause, first of all, for everything.
Thank you. I had to enable the preferences box to let it do it. So here we go, play. Right, and I'm not at the beginning, so I'll have to see if I can get back somehow. Just a minute, but here we are. Right, sorry about that, folks. It's a new computer, so it's had to be put the things on when I started it up today. Right, we've heard quite a bit about Abbot William from Janet, which explains his sort of situation, his origins. What tends to be overlooked is that at Rievaulx, he actually set down and founded the whole site. You can see it, the view that everybody knows from the entrance to the site when you go up. And it's notable, of course, that it's on this gradual slope going up to a much steeper slope at the top beyond the church. And it's actually built in a series of man-made terraces. Now, when we did our original book in 1999, we had this geophysics plot of the cloister done by John Szymanski. And he found this outline of a building, which we think is the first church. So on the left, you can see this, and on the right is the interpretation I did of that. So it looks like they plonked a church on what is now the side of the cloister. And that can't have lasted very long, because very soon, I think, well, certainly by 1145, when William dies, the whole place was up. And we published this outline drawing in our book. And I propose to review this now and actually look again at the evidence and see if we can produce more on this and push it further on. And as you can see, I put on this viewing chamber below shrine. Well, this viewing chamber is mentioned in our book, but not actually illustrated. So this is where it is. It's actually below St. William's 13th century shrine, which is in an embrasure of the 12th century chapter house window. And last year in March, before lockdown, we cleared this out because it was filled up with silt. They just washed in there. Something I'd done back in the 90s, 25 or 30 years ago, when I originally looked at this. And this is what's down there. Now, very few people have actually seen this. And as you can see, there are 5 courses of ashlar masonry of the first period of building. It has on the jamb down here, you can see this small chamfer work, which tapers off to a point here, fades out. So the floor level is going to be down here somewhere. This is the west wall of the eastern range of Abbot William. And of course, it's well over a metre. The scale on the left, red and white scale, is a metre in length. So it's well over a metre below the depth of the present cloister floor. And if we look in cross section, you can see the drawing on the left, and on the right, there's also shows in brown the cross section of that wall, the rubble stone foundation at the bottom in blue, and a concrete slab upon which the shrine now stands. And I think the concrete slab is mainly there so you can have the viewing chamber of the earlier range underneath. Now, when we look then to the east wall, or where its likely position is, if you look at the benching, which you can see in this photograph, note that it goes from here, it rises up and it goes down again there. So sitting in the middle here is a buried wall. And the benching behind where the photograph was taken does the same thing, and the next wall and the next wall and the next wall all have broken their back over this buried wall, which is the equivalent to what you've just seen underneath the shrine, but on the east wall. So we put these together, or I put these together, and you can see in this, the published plan, this is why we have the shrine as a little square bit, and then we have this much longer piece of east wall because we can trace its presence through all those other later cross walls that have deformed over its site. And it is certainly something like the same width as the western range, which is the only standing part of William's monastery. And talking which, here we are. Now, this is the largest bit that survives from the first period conventional claustral layout. And it's probably one of the oldest Cistercian buildings of which we have standing remains in Europe, probably earlier than anything now in France. And you can see, looking at the photograph, that there is evidence for segmental headed rear arches above where the original windows were placed, the stonework for their embrasures having been completely robbed out. And there's also evidence on here for a pentise standing against this wall and 3 corbels. If we look on the other side, this tells us quite a bit more, because you can see the jambs here, and particularly this one here, is done with coins. So we've got the tapers on the jambs, we know their positions. Up here we've got a double splay for the dormitory windows. There's another one here standing 4 courses high. And then if we look from the side, you can actually see there's a substantial offset course which marks the level of the dormitory floor. So the wall steps back and thins above floor level. Now, if you look in the other wall, you can see at the top of it, there's a square socket here and a square socket here, and these are for the transverse timber beams carrying the floor, which was probably boarded with oak floorboards, broad boards, and probably plastered over the top. And then looking afresh at the standing west wall, you start to see other things which really you shouldn't be there, because this is reused, recycled stonework from another building. And the only place I can think it's coming from is that church that stood in the cloister. And once the other buildings were up and they'd got a new church, they demolished it. And it was pulled down just at the time they were building the West Range. So here is a chamfer jamb from it. Here is another one with the chamfer on this side, nicely squared. And this one looks to be a voussoir with the taper on it, a curve here. And then this one is interesting. Well, there are two. There's this one here, but this other stone here has got a channel in it and what looks like an iron fitting of some description. We haven't had a ladder up to look at that in detail yet. So there's that recycled material going to this building. So we measured all this up and managed to produce an elevation. And on the right, you can see these window embrasures with their segmental heads, and the internal rear arches are segmental following this curve. I've shown two different openings in the jambs, which have all gone. A segmental one possibly, but more likely, I think, a round-headed one into that embrasure. So doing this, we can get an idea of what the building looked like. It's unvaulted, it's quite narrow, it's less than 22 feet wide internally. And it appears to have been raised in height, the floor, from the original ones. Now, this line here below the windows is the present floor level, which is far too high, I think. The one below it is in the room, the parlour to the south of these remains. And then on the left here, I just dropped in that drawing of the East Range wall, which would put the floor down at where the bottom line is here, if it's the same all the way around. So there's quite a lot of archaeology in here, I think, and we did want to get a sondage in a couple of places to try and test this out for depth, but COVID intervened, so it never got done. Now, if we go to the southwest corner of the cloister, you can find that there is in fact a original corner within the core here of the later 12th century wall. And it's marked here on the left arch, and you can see the little stub coming out for this wall. Now, this wall is the same as the wall in the picture, which now forms the north wall of the current refectory, but was the south wall of William's refectory. And at the end of his refectory, or the kitchen block, there is now the springings for two arches. And that's why on the plan we put arch. And here's the left-hand springing, and here's the right-hand springing. And it's symmetrical about the wall lines, because where the scale rod is, just to the left of it, is the coinings for the north wall of William's parallel refectory, which was demolished. And if you go around the other side, you can see that the springings for the arches are considerably lower than the present cloister level. And we just scraped the moss off the stone at the bottom, which is a chamfered block. Now, we don't know what happens with that, because if you look at the drawing on the left, this shows the arch put back together and the level it's at. And then the chamfer stone is, and the line between them is, that's as low as it goes at the moment. We don't know whether there are jambs going below and the floor is actually much lower still. This was a problem, this was a subject that we hoped to address, but didn't get the chance because of COVID. So if we go back to this and put a summary on the right, the original refectory was in what is now the South Cloister Alley and was parallel in a Benedictine fashion to the Cloister Alley. But this also pushes, if we've got a square refectory, it pushes the position of the North Cloister Alley much further north. So when they built Aelred's church, eventually they built a new refectory further south and restored the cloister back to a square plan, because Aelred's church took a great chunk off the northern end, as indicated on this drawing. But what we didn't consider when we did this drawing, the main drainage arrangement. and taking into account the topography. So if you look on site, what you can see is on the west side, you can see this quite steep banked up area. And most of that, beyond the line of the cloister south alley, is actually tip. It's from the blast furnace after the abbey had been closed. And it's called Furnace Hill. And where I stood to take this picture is about where the main drain comes out from underneath the current refectory, and it disappears somewhere under that great hump of tip, which wouldn't have been the case in the 12th century. So this has all gone over the site and distorted its arrangements. And an excavation by Jury MacDonald, well, 15 or more years ago on the other side, where for a garage, he did a watching brief, showed that the ground was soil. It's all stained orange. It's full of iron slag. It really is furnace tipping. So I think the line of the main drain is therefore that laid down by William's monastery. You tend to put your drain in first and when you put your first buildings up. And of course, you cannot make water run uphill. So therefore, it runs on its optimum course in its present situation and has done, I think, right from the start. So this is a drain looking up it. It's quite silted up. There was quite a lot of water when I took this picture last week. That's coming from springs filtering down. A camera was put up the drain and got right up into the refectory until there was a blockage and it couldn't go any further. So we know it goes in a straight line right under the present refectory. So I put that in. And I think what this enables to do now is to make a more complete plan. There was likely an infirmary to the east of William's East Range. We know there's a documented guest house arrangement, which would have been a guest hall and a guest house somewhere to the west of the abbey. And there was probably a lay brothers infirmary as well. But if we use the main drain line and extend the east and west ranges down to it and add the latrines, I think we've got virtually a complete claustral plan with some confidence that it's right for William's monastery. So this is what Rievaulx probably looked like when Aelred became abbot. And I've dropped in the plan of Melrose, slightly adapted at scale, to give an idea of what William's church was possibly like. And this is a simple computer model to show that arrangement. I've coloured the ground levels to show various changes in slope. So the light greens, the more or less near a plateaued section on the top of the valley edge. And then it slopes down more steeply so that the buildings coming down from beyond the cloister were in fact 3 stories in height, not 2 stories. And here you get a better impression with this view. So this is an arrangement I think that's most likely for the time, but there's a lot of archaeology here that could be tested out yet, because I think William's monastery is a good metre below or more Aelred's later building. Now, having done that, I will turn to one more question, the mysterious building against the north transept of Aelred's church. And this is a scan of the published page on that from our book. And you can see its roof line here. And I'm just going to go into that slightly more detail. Here you can see it. And on the right here, this is the string course at this point with the 2 sockets, and you can see the cut line for the roof. Over on this other buttress to the left, there is an identical couple of sockets and there is another matching roof line. Quite noticeably, what happens is that the door here for the cemetery on the left is the original doorway. So this building, whatever it is, was there right from the start. And the doorway respects its presence. I think where the 13th century door is now located, there was probably an earlier 12th century one, identical to the one that survives on the left. So this is the summary of that. So to update this, you really should have a doorway like that sitting here. to give access to this structure. So this begs the obvious question, what was it? Well, I'm going to fly a kite here and say, I'll leave you with this question. Could it actually be the retained end of William's north transept turned into a chapel? And as you can see at the top here, if William's church is further north, its transept could have stuck out beyond the line of Aelred's church, shown in this darker colour, and have been modified and retained when Aelred built his church. And if that's right, we have actually got some good dimensional height data for the transept of William's church. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Stuart. And that, I really do think the applause, I hope, resonating around the world. And it showed there's Stuart's genius for finding a piece of stonework, either loose or embedded in a later wall, and being able to work something out and say something intelligent and fascinating about it. Now, we've got 10 minutes for questions. You know, I didn't want this session to be too, this conference to be too boot camp and keep people at their computers all day long. So anyway, for questions, please type them into the Q&A function and I'll read them out for, oh, and I can see them already coming in. This is from William Evans. Could I please ask what the reaction was of the St Cuthbert community to the arrival of the Cistercians? And I think that's for Janet.
Well, excuse me. So I'll just have to have a glass of water. The Cistercians, I think, didn't perhaps threaten the position or the status of Durham to the extent that they did perhaps St Mary's, York, and the Benedictine houses. Durham really had carved out its influence and its status in the northeast there. One thing we do know, of course, and this is from Anne Lawrence's work, is how Durham and the Yorkshire Cistercians seem to have influenced each other in terms of manuscript illumination, which suggests that you know, there was collaboration there. Did impact, of course, when the Cistercians captured a high-level recruit from Durham, so they were not immune in that way. But I think probably as an institution, the reaction would not have been one of quite so perhaps defensive as it was, say, in York.
Great, thank you very much, Shanna. And I'll exercise a chair's privilege and ask a question. You ended with that tantalising bit of evidence about perhaps retention of part of the north transept of William's church as a chapel. Can you think of a possible function of it and why they did it?
Only as a chapel, I think. It's very strange. I mean, I'm flying a complete kite here, but why is that building there? It's totally enigmatic. There's no parallels for it in the Cistercian context whatsoever. But clearly that doorway respects its presence, so it's there from the start. I can't see any other reason why they'd put the doorway in the eastern bay.
I mean, as you said, it's extraordinary that they did it, and you know, and I know, and you know, it begs questions about did that building have a special association with sanctity or a special resonance with William's monastery?
Well, one of the most annoying things archaeologically is there's a metal water pipe runs through under that doorway and through there. And if you try and do any geophysics, it just drives it nuts. It just goes off the scale on a big screen. So we can't even do geophysics to look for the foundations of the building. So, which is highly frustrating. So you'd have to go back to, I mean, radar might get it and the pipe not interfere with radar, but certainly other conventional geophysics just don't stand a chance because of this metal pipe. You'd have to dig it up, I think, to look for it. This is why I'm saying there's an awful lot of buried archaeology at Rievaulx, quite deeply buried, and walls standing a metre high or plus, buried underground from this first range.
I've got a question for Janet, if I may, and it sort of follows up from the one that you just had. And, you know, it really this idea of the Cistercians as missionaries to the north, and the very militaristic language that's used and such like that. The extent to which do you think from the outset they really did see themselves as following in the footsteps of the great monastic Anglo-Saxon saints of Northumbria and the conversion missions of the 7th and 8th centuries?
Yes, I think they were, and I think it's important to note that the Cistercians do seem to have been, proactive in their expansion right from the beginning. I mean, there is in the Carta Caritatis, when it's talking, I think, about the foundation of new abbeys and daughter houses, when our abbeys grow big enough that a daughter house can be founded, as if that this is a given, that this is what they're going to do. They don't wait around for people coming along and asking for their 12 monks and an abbot to make a new foundation. They're out there seeing the opportunities. But certainly, I think within the context of Yorkshire, the evidence is pointing in the direction of the sort of conscious knowledge that they are following in the footsteps of the pioneer monks. So yes, I think I would agree with your proposition there, Michael.
And also the other one is, it was fascinating what you were saying about the length of the foundation process. And, we confidently state in our visitor literature and interpretations at Rievaulx of a foundation date of March 1132. Do you think we need to revisit that?
I'm not so hung up on, putting a date on things or changing dates. If that is, that was what was decided, that this is the point that we are going to mark a formal foundation and the beginning of monastic life, then I'm not worried about that. But I am concerned that we recognise this as a point in a longer process. And what's so great about looking at Rievaulx and the evidence that we have is that it does reveal something of that sort of prehistory of a foundation that is so often hidden from us. Very often, our knowledge of the history of a religious house starts with a foundation charter. And that may have reference to some of those who have been influential, but doesn't always. And it's this sort of this glimpse into what is behind it all that I think is so fascinating about Rievaulx and and fountains and about the settlement of the north.
We've got time for one more question. If anybody would like to type something in, I'll read it out. Can't see anything being typed in. So, well, let's around the world join our hands together and applaud our speakers again for an excellent introduction that really has set the historical and architectural scene for what's going to come. And we're now going to be moving on to the man himself, Aelred, and we're going to be looking at what really makes him so special. And, as Anna's introduction said, he is such a multifaceted man. And this next session is going to be looking at his theological prowess and also as Aelred as the patron. And we couldn't have better people to be doing this. We've got Marsha, Dutton and Peter Fergusson. And we're going to start off with Marsha. And well, for a lot of people, she won't need much introduction, but anybody who is reading Aelred's works today will have come across Marsha's, editions of his works. His life, the life by Walter Daniel, which so many people turn to when first studying Aelred, has this wonderful introduction by Marsha, which I look at, for inspiration at times when I'm trying to write my interpretations and write my articles and things. And she's also the editor of the Brill Companion to Aelred of Rievaulx. And she's very kindly agreed to speak to this conference. We couldn't have had a conference without her. She's been an enthusiastic backer of the event. So I'm going to hand over to Marsha as a paper now, Finding God in the Memory According to Aelred of Rievaulx. Thank you, Marsha. Oh, I think you're on mute, Marsha. Have you unmuted?
There we go.
Hey, great.
So,
Good. Thank you, Michael and Anna, for your kind words. I, of course, have been constantly influenced and guided and helped by all the other scholars who are here. I'm disappointed, of course, that that we didn't get to be present to one another in person at this time. I was so looking forward to being with people I already knew and people I didn't yet know in person. So thank you all for all your work. Pierre-André Burton has argued that friendship is the hermeneutic key to Aelred's thought and work. Appealing as that view is, it seems to me to require a reach beyond what Aelred actually says or intends, but that claim is an equivalent to my own desire to find what I think of as Aelredian string theory, an idea connecting all his works. Recently, I've been increasingly persuaded that it might be found in his reliance on St. Augustine's mystical theology for his own spiritual teaching. Augustine repeatedly articulated his understanding of the tripartite human mens, or soul, as embodying the image of the Trinitarian God, explaining that the soul is composed of three inseparable substances: reason, memory, and will. This mirroring of the Trinity, he says, is God's image in the human person, who is thereby able to know and love God, to cling to God through participation in him, and by working to repair the fallen image, to come ever closer to him. Aelred found Augustine's identification of God's image in humankind with this trinity of reason, memory, and will as the means through which humans can move toward union with God so compelling that early in his first treatise, Mirror of Charity, he concisely rephrased it with one important modification. Declaring that God created all things in order that men and women might seek him, find him, and love him, and so be happy, Aelred moves to the practical issue of how in fact they may do those things. His answer is essentially Augustine's. He writes, in creating the universe, God not only gave man being, but in addition, he granted that he be happy. Made in the image of its creator, the rational creature may cling to him whose image it is, because this is its sole good. Obviously, this clinging is not of the flesh, but of the spirit, in which the author of all natures inserted three things that allow it to share his eternity, participate in his wisdom, and taste his sweetness. By these three, I mean memory, understanding, and love or will. Memory is capable of eternity, understanding of wisdom, and love of sweetness. In these three, man was created in the image of the Trinity. Memory held fast to God without forgetfulness. Understanding recognized him without error, and love embraced him without the self-centered desire for anything else. So we were happy. 20-some years later, in On the Soul, Aelred sought to provide a detailed explanation of Augustine's teaching, shaping the work as a dialogue between the abbot Aelredus and a young monk, John. Although in Mirror, he had presented the concept without identifying it as Augustine's, in this late work, he begins with Augustine, or at least with John's asking for help in understanding something Augustine had written about the soul. In Book 1, Aelredus answers John's preliminary questions about the soul and identifies its three inseparable constituents. In Book 2, he considers them individually, beginning with memory. Now, the memory has one supreme quality that overrides all else, he says. It has the capacity of receiving God. From the moment that one knows God, God begins to dwell in that person's memory. And as often as the person brings God to mind, he finds him there. So Aelred begins his first major piece of monastic writing with a detailed description of the way the soul allows a person to know and love God, and then returns to it at the end of his life, in both cases focusing on the role of memory. The real importance of his appreciation of Augustinian anthropology, however, lies in his sermons and treatises. In Augustine's explanation of the power of memory to share God's eternity, Aelred found the theological core of the spiritual pedagogy through which he sought to guide those who heard his sermons and read his treatises to find and love God. Aelred repeatedly includes the Augustinian explanation of the soul in his sermons. In a sermon on the Annunciation, he writes of Mary, "Truly she is full of grace, for her memory dwelt on nothing but God, her reason gazed upon nothing else, her love found savor in nothing other than him." In other sermons, he explains memory as that which allows humankind to share God's eternity, as in Mirror. Writing on the Ascension, he says, "Everlastingness seems to be a synonym for memory, set up in triplicate with reason and will." In a sermon on the Nativity, he says of Adam and Eve, "Their happiness consisted in the presence of God in memory, knowledge and reason, love and the will. Memory was like an embrace by the soul with which it held on to God with no forgetting." In most of his treatises, Aelred says little about Augustine's teaching on the soul. Despite summarizing it in Mirror and on the Soul, in treatises of spiritual guidance, he simply translates it into practice as a method, a praxis, through which he may assist Christians to know and love God. His purpose there is to show God present in the soul and specifically in memory, so that men and women may find him there, always present and known each time they bring him to mind. And while he most often writes of Jesus, the incarnate God, he regularly pauses to remind his readers that Jesus is in fact God. Aelred's method relies on 4 aspects of memory. 2 deal with past and present experience. The memory has the capacity to receive God, and one can reliably find God there whenever one brings him to mind. The other 2 move from present experience of God into the future. Memory allows one to cling to God without forgetfulness and so share God's eternity, and memory connects past to present to future. The 2 treatises where Aelred most clearly relies on this pedagogical method, grounded in the role of memory in the soul, are Jesus as a Boy of 12 and The Formation of Recluses. In both, he begins by addressing someone who has, he says, personally asked for his help. In each case, he assists that person to call Jesus to mind in events remembered from Scripture, then to recall Jesus' presence from their own experience, and finally to stand before Jesus contemplatively, looking into beatitude. Thus, each work culminates in what Mary Carruthers defines as memory of the future, as seekers move beyond finding God in past and present memory to embrace him without forgetfulness in eternity. Someone once characterized the Odyssey as beginning with a man-sized hole, as Telemachus sets out to find his father. Jesus as a Boy of 12 has something of the same structure, beginning not with Jesus, but with the memory of his absence and his parents' desperate search to find him. Aelred begins with a request from Evo, a young monk, to help him understand the Lucan pericope of Jesus remaining behind in the temple in Jerusalem as his parents travel home. Aelred at once recalls his own long ago familiarity with that story and his loss of the devotion that it had then inspired in him. He writes, "Suddenly there came to mind what effect these same words of the gospel had on me more than once when they were read or sung. I looked back and saw how far behind me I had left those sweet and pleasant experiences, how far from those delights the distractions and anxieties of business have removed me." Then he demonstrates God's readiness to respond at once when called to mind. "Remembering this, I was pouring out my soul within myself when the Lord put out his hand and touched my heart and anointed it with the unction of mercy." Aelred then returns to Evo's need for help, linking that desire with Mary's. "You begged me to suggest to you where the boy Jesus was during those days when his mother was looking for him, where he found shelter, what food he ate, what business occupied him." Almost at once, though, he turns to the third seeker, Mary, chastising her, and so himself and his audience, for her lack of attention. "Why did you, my dearest lady, look for the boy who you knew well was God? Is it not he who feeds and nourishes all things? Indeed, my lady, if you will allow me to say so, why did you lose your dearest son so easily? Why did you watch over him with so little care? Why were you so late in noticing that he was missing? The work thus begins with 3 absences and 3 memories of the one who has been lost: Evo's, Aelred's, and Mary's. Aelred's initial goal is to assist Evo to join Mary in searching for Jesus. At the same time, of course, he writes not just for the one monk who has asked for help, but for all who need assistance in recovering lost understanding, lost faith, the lost ability to know and love Jesus. After initially chastising Mary for losing track of Jesus, once she has found him in the temple, Aelred commends her for subsequently keeping him well in mind. He says, while others did not understand what Jesus had said to her, Mary, knowing and understanding, kept all these words, pondering them in her heart. She kept them in memory. She pondered them in meditation, and she compared them with other things that she had seen and heard of him. This is, of course, Aelred's counsel to all those for whom he is writing. But he goes on to point out the value of Mary's own exercise of memory for others whom it will assist down the centuries. So the Most Blessed Virgin was even then making merciful provision for us in order that matters so necessary might not be lost to memory through any neglect, and therefore not written down or proclaimed, with the result that his followers would be deprived of such delightful spiritual manna. This most prudent virgin therefore faithfully preserved all these things. Then when the time came, she told of them and entrusted them to the holy apostles and disciples to be preached. So Aelred expands the meaning of this episode by making his larger audience explicit, explaining that by remembering all that had happened, Mary was able to communicate the work of her memory to assist those who would pass its meaning onward. This first book of the treatise thus begins and ends with memory's ability to receive God and to find God whenever one brings him to mind. Evo, Aelred, and Mary have all in different ways known Jesus but turned away from him, and have all recovered him by remembering and seeking him. Mary's loss, search, and recovery takes place in the past, in the temporal event, but then she keeps him in memory for the benefit of those who will follow her. Aelred and Evo imitate her by bringing him to mind. The second book of On Jesus moves into the 3rd and 4th aspects of the soul's knowledge of God, the ability to share God's eternity and to link past to present to future. Aelred now reminds his audience, no longer identified with Evo, that the Jesus sought in the first book is himself the Lord our God, and that, quote, the unchangeable God became changeable so that in our one unique Savior, there should be the way by which we might mount on high, the life to which we might come, and the truth which we might enjoy. Aelred then explains the next stage in his method, that one may imitate Jesus' life in order to know God in his eternity. His bodily progress is our spiritual progress, and what we are told he did at each stage of his life is reproduced in us spiritually. At the end of this stage, as memory has linked past to present to future, Aelred guides his hearers as they in contemplation approach Jesus, waiting in beatitude. He says, you are able to study the hidden things of the Spirit in your own experience. Jerusalem, to which he went up at the age of 12, is the contemplation of heavenly secrets. Having followed the remembered stages of Jesus' life, the seeker is able at last to view Jesus in beatitude, where he waits in welcome. So in this work, Aelred first leads his audience to the past, remembering one episode in the human life of Jesus, and then by remembering that life, to imitate it, growing more and more like him in virtue and devotion, until finally able to look into the future, anticipating the sharing of God's eternity. In Formation of Anchoresses, Aelred follows very much the same approach, responding to the request of an anchoress, whom he calls his sister, to give her directions for her anchoritic life by explaining to her how she may grow in the love of Jesus. But where On Jesus begins with absence, moving from the loss of Jesus until finding him and being welcomed to beatitude. In Formation, Aelred assumes not Jesus' absence, but his presence in the images of the Passion on the anchoress's altar. But he still perceives her need to grow in love for Jesus and explains the way she may do that. If that sweet love for Jesus is to grow in your affections, he writes, you need a threefold meditation on the past, the present, and the future. That is to say, what happened long ago, what you experience in the present, and what lies in the future. Following that plan, he directs her to participate in the events of Jesus' life, remembered from Scripture, then to recall the ways Jesus has given her inspiration and anticipation of heaven in her own daily experiences, and finally to see herself there in heaven, standing before Jesus the judge in her own memory of the future. He concludes the work by explaining exactly what he hopes the effect of this approach will be. These, sister, are some seeds of spiritual meditation, which I have made it my business to sow for you, concerning the memory of Christ's boons in the past, the experience of things present, and the expectation of what lies in the future, to the end that from them a rich crop of the love of God may spring up and grow to maturity. Meditation will arouse the affections will give birth to desire will stir up tears, so that your tears may be bread for you day and night, until you appear in his sight and are received in his embrace, and say to him what is written in the Song of Songs, my beloved is mine, and I am his. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marsha, for a typically accessible introduction to theology. And that's one of the things of Marsha's work. You know, you can turn to it. And you know, I find a lot of contemporary scholarship on theology and other theology very, very difficult to get into. Marsha has a wonderful talent of making it readable for people of all faiths and none, I think. And it really has given a sense. Also, I think of Aelred's warmth and the breadth of his theological writings. The number of titles you managed to get in of his works there was actually quite remarkable. So thank you very much. We'll be taking this in questions at the end, and I'm very sorry to people whose questions I met in chat. If we have time at the end of the session, I'll try and get those in, and if not, I'll forward them on to the to the relevant speaker. But now I'm going to move on to ask to Peter Fergusson. And Peter has sent me a typically modest introduction to read out. It says, Peter Fergusson is the Feldberg Professor of Art History Emeritus at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. He is Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London and of the Medieval Academy of America. Anybody who knows Peter and his works will know that this is a massive understatement of his many, many accomplishments. And I will hand over to Peter now, who will be talking about the context of Aelred's Rievaulx buildings and Precinct development in the 1150s. So a virtual round of applause for Peter as he comes to the virtual podium. Thank you very much, Peter. Are you okay there, Peter? Are you on mute?
Peter, we're just trying to get the PowerPoint. And all right, now we're back on speaker view and we have the PowerPoint open. So we go to save screen, is that it?
Share screen, yeah. The green share screen button.
Share screen. And I think this is it. Share.
Yes, excellent.
Okay. And then I want to go to full screen here.
Yeah. It's the. Can you see where I pointed to?
I don't see the full screen.
Right hand. It's the icons at the bottom, and it's the one that looks a little bit like a podium. There we are. Yeah.
What's that?
Wonderful.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And Michael, my admiration to you for organizing the symposium and conference and for willing it into happening. And my thanks to you for your kind words and invitation to offer a paper. One of the goals in the book on Rievaulx Abbey, published by Yale more than 20 years ago, and written by Stuart and myself, was to establish a chronology of building over its 400-year history, from the first settlement of monks and lay brothers in 1132 to the community's suppression in 1538-9. More than we fully anticipated, the dominant building campaign took place in Aelred's 20-year abbatial rule, and specifically during the first half of the early 1150s. In these years, Aelred rebuilt the monastery, chose a new site for the community's church, and expanded its cloister, employing an architecture different from that of the abbey's founder and saintly predecessor, William. His constructional campaign poses questions about the order's development and its reputation in the literature for consistency in planning and, to a lesser degree, in design. Further additions beyond those published by us about Aelred's work at Rievaulx are likely. At best, we know only something in the region of 65% of what he constructed. This unidentified work stems from a revaluation in the present of what constitutes a medieval abbey site. In contrast to prevailing ideas of a century ago, during the struggle to define the criteria of guardianship to protect deteriorating national monuments. In my talk, I want to mention this progressive widening of concept before offering two important examples of Aelred's work omitted from the corpus of his rebuilding. Towards the end of World War I, the care of historic monuments passed from the hands of private owners into government responsibility, requiring an act of Parliament to create the Office of Works, now known as Historic England. The new legislation was prompted by the deteriorating condition of Rievaulx. Following the Act's passage, celebrations dissolved after surveys revealed that Rievaulx was a tottering ruin in danger of imminent collapse. Also revealed were the limitations of the negotiated 8 acres out of 98 acres originally within the Abbey's perimeter precinct wall of Lord Feversham's land, requested by the Office of Works to become the Abbey site. Embarrassed renegotiations for greater amounts of land were to mark the next 20 years. Underlying the modesty of the land request, Sir Charles Peers, the main proponent of the legislation, protected the valley's celebrated topographical features. A century before Parliament's legislation, writers, artists, visitors championed the valley in the North York Moors as the first example of England's most original contribution towards landscape innovation. The picturesque English landscape garden, adorned with its authentic Gothic ruin. To clear the debris from the site when the war ended, Pearce persuaded the authorities to use the trenching skills of demobilized, unemployed soldiers. Accordingly, an estimated 90,000 tons of debris were distributed over the lumpy topography of buildings adjacent to the ruin, left from the suppression of the monasteries 300 years earlier, with the goal to better, quote, set off the ruin, unquote. For Piers, an historic abbey consisted of the church and the buildings around the great cloister. In step with this aesthetic, exposed debris was buried. Larger masonry details were formed into fictive boundaries, since reconstruction was taboo. A pastoral farm was imposed upon the precinct and survives into the present day. As the walls and foundations emerged at Rievaulx, an interested public wanted guidance about what they were looking at. No documents survived to give a start to the work or an end. No master mason's name or patron surfaced. Ornament was ambiguous as to date and difficult to relate to known monuments. And, not least, Rievaulx's rough masonry offered few clues to contrast to the carefully cut ashlars common at too many sites. The absence of clarity on date and patronage haunted early site guides. Even Pevsner's perceptive 1966 entry in his Buildings of England for North Yorkshire wobbles on the latter. Yet the solution to the dating problem lay in a well-known source. Composed by the monk's infirmary master, Walter Daniels, Vita of Aelred, noted his request in 1157 to the General Chapter meeting at Citeaux to first allow him to move out of the monk's dormitory. Next slide, which you see here, into the infirmary to the bottom right, because his ill health disrupted their sleep, and then as his ailments worsened, to build a separate residence which links the infirmary to the East Range, as is indicated in the bottom bottom writing. The chronology issue eluded scholars, however. Stuart Harrison's early 1990s examination of the rough masonry demonstrated a context of completed buildings prior to the repositioning of the church, built on the impressive terraced hillside above the cloister, and extended the cloister southwards related to it. With the labor force of 500 lay brothers specified by Walter Daniel, it is plausible to argue for Aelred's rebuilding campaign lasting about 5 years. Such was the case in a similarly scaled undertaking in the south of England, also from the 1150s, the rebuilding of much of Christ Church, Canterbury. Construction dates are close, but Canterbury's innovations appear before Rievaulx and are recorded in the famous drawing placed at the end of the Edwin Psalter in Trinity College, Cambridge. Providing 4 separate buildings for hospitality, along with an outer court with a bathhouse for the monks and for travelers, 2 gatehouses with law halls, and not least a house for the prior, which you see in the Edwin Psalter drawing on the screen. And you can see the end of the church on the right, the infirmary, And just to the left, into the outer court, you can see the house for the prior of Canterbury. All four depart from monastic traditions and serve as markers of social divisioning. I use Aelred's Abbot House to illustrate the way evidence in plain sight, documentary as well as physical, can lie dormant if it lacks a sequence of connections. As a contrast, I now want to turn to the two cases I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. The first has to do with hospitality. This ancient obligation was observed by all monasteries on the command of Christ in the Gospels. From Rievaulx's earliest year, a guest house is noted by Walter Daniel, in which Aelred waited before entering the novitiate. For unrecorded reasons, fire broke out, but Aelred extinguished it with a jug of beer and the help of some lay brothers. Although the guest house location is unknown, hospitality buildings following tradition lay close to the great gatehouse, which at Rievaulx lay to the northwest, adjacent to the lay brothers' claustral range, the latter explaining their assistance. A similar location marked Canterbury's hospitality buildings. Right, which you see now in Stuart's model. A similar location, marked Canterbury's hospital buildings for the gentry, the common hall, and the servants' hall. Rievaulx's hospitality buildings are mentioned in the suppression inventories, but to my knowledge, there has been no attempt or interest to have them surveyed or excavated. At Fountains, 25 miles or so to the west of Rievaulx, 3 hall-type buildings constructed in the 1170s have stood derelict since suppression. Clearly, the buildings fall into the same differentiated social groups as those at Canterbury. Glyn Coppach's clearance of them in the early 1990s, allied to the electromagnetic resistivity survey commissioned from John Szymanski of York University, also revealed the foundations of the massive common hall lying under the green sward in front of the monastery's west range. You can see it in this dry image, the bottom image, the outline of the piers and the building. Better than anything else, the common hall size reveals the press of visitors expecting hospitality in the third quarter of the 12th century, along with supporting buildings, such as their kitchen, the mill for bread, a brew house, stabling for visitors' horses, and provisions for sanitation. The question remains, where did Fountains get the idea? Could Rievaulx have provided the source? My second example has to do with water, the basic necessity for every monastery, whether located in cities or rural isolation. Cistercian sites provide no better example of rural seclusion in the North York moors than Rievaulx. when water proved unreliable, all medieval foundations faced migration and demoralization following the site's abandonment. Such was the experience of Byland, Rievaulx's closest neighbor, which was forced to root up and move to a second, a third, and even a fourth site due to water problems. Rievaulx's water has a history of its own, with active scholarly input. Forgive the backward writing on the plan. I'm going to move from the bottom to the top. Rievaulx's history is still active, as last year's output by Trevor Pearson showed, although still without agreement. The community's founders placed the monastery buildings on man-made terraces, slotted into the hillside a third of the way up the formidable south-facing slope named Bank Wood, a decision eliminating the not infrequent springtime flooding from the River Ree, and, parenthetically, a decision overlooked by modern architects to their sorrow. During Abbot William's rule, water was needed throughout the year by around 400 persons, made up of monks, conversi, servants, visitors, and their horses. In Aelred's day, the figure lay closer to 800 persons. To serve them, a triple-sourced, gravity-fed water system was developed. Dismantled at this suppression, only traces of its watercourses survive. A stunning development when compared to the bounty of the valley's medieval water is Rievaulx in the present, the driest site in England. Rievaulx's principal supply came from the River Ree, or in Norman French, hence Rievaulx, the valley of the Ree, which ran more or less west to east through the middle of the valley. In other words, bottom right to top left. A cutwater about a mile from the abbey at the Pennypiece Quarry diverted the river's northern course into a masonry-lined channel leading to the main buildings, there to provide sanitation to the outer court and the monastic enclosure, with the southern course diverted to the foot of Ashbury Hill, before rejoining the river about a mile east of the monastery. This diversion opened up 30% more meadow for grazing and stock taking within Rievaulx's precinct wall, and should be credited to Aelred's negotiations with Byland Abbey, which owned the land. The second water source, came from above the monastery. On the western side, generous freshwater springs from Bankwood supplied mill ponds to grind grain, fulling, and light industrial applications, as well as for daily sanitation flushing for the central complex of buildings. By contrast, Bankwood's eastern springs, controlled by conduit houses and filtered in settling tanks before being piped into the claustral nucleus, supplied the inner and outer courts, the infirmary master's garden, the fruit trees mentioned by Walter Daniel above the monks' cemetery, and further east for the fish pond to serve provisioning. It also supplied water for laundry, hand washing before meals, and for liturgical cleansing before the monks entered their choir, just as it did for Benedictine houses. This is this shows you the fountains refectory laver. You sat on the top, and the mandatum took place with the abbot kneeling before you. Actively promoted by Saint Bernard, who died in 1153, as the 8th sacrament, the mandatum was performed by the abbot as a rite of abbatial humility and communal love. Another Cistercian abbey, Rievaulx in South Yorkshire, in its valley site and topographical parallels, bears a striking resemblance to Rievaulx. Powerful rock faces formed Rievaulx's southern and northern boundaries. Rievaulx's name derives from the Latin Santa Maria dei Rupei, rupes meaning rock or cliff. The valley's west entry contains the active Maltby Dyke, which you see on the plan. Originally running through the center of the valley, like the River Ree at Rievaulx, with its eastern flank the land fans outwards to power mills and mitigate flooding. Difficult early years marked Rievaulx's development and held in check later expansions, as was the case for successful foundations like Rievaulx. Construction of what we see today began about 10 years behind Aelred's work at Rievaulx, modeled on precinct expansion achieved through river diversion. The discovery in the 1930s of parts of the Beck's masonry-lined open water channels led to restoration. Even if what we see today is as much scenic as authentic, the water's constancy and the murmur of its flow through the ruined buildings supplies visitors with the background sound of water in the 400 years of Rievaulx's monastic service. A cutwater adjacent to the Great Gatehouse diverted part of the Maltby Dyke to serve the sanitation needs of the claustral nucleus, while the rest of the dyke was rerouted to the south to open up an expanded precinct for buildings, including those for hospitality, similar to fountains. A second water source, piped and filtered, supplied the claustral buildings with freshwater springs on the abbey's northern side, like Rievaulx. And a third source, constructed on raised ground to the south, as you see in the left-hand plan, constructed on raised ground is the impressive Houghton Pond, which supplies an open, narrow, masonry-lined channel to the abbot's house before intersecting with the west to east flow of the Maltby Dyke at the monk's toilet outflow, and thence to proceed downstream to drive the mills. In summary, I've attempted to show the changing concepts underlying Rievaulx as a historic abbey site. Its site, Guardian Historic England, has been generous, particularly providing visitor services such as the Welcome Centre, better parking, public sanitation, a museum, signage, fuller site guides, and has even tolerated moderate site changes, such as lifting the high altar overthrown 500 years ago at suppression and lying untouched since. At the same time, it has to be admitted that Rievaulx ruins have changed little from the way they were 100 years ago. The expanding, interest-filled, multidisciplinary scholarship from authors in our seminar offers an alignment of what is known, with what is shown, an alignment of what is known with what is shown, and warrants recognition. Not that I am without fault. Our book makes no mention of hospitality in its related buildings. Elsewhere, consolidation of valuable pavements from the terraces temples is needed, as well as from Piers's clearance of 100 years ago, who sent pavements to the British Museum for security, where they lie unseen in its basement, where floors and roofs placed over the refectory and warming room, a more authentic monastic experience would open up. Money, money. Could the European model of withholding 2 to 3% of visitor admissions support such discoveries? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Applause from around the world. I think I can see some from my fellow participants. And it's typically broad ranging, and just showing, Peter, how modest your introduction was and how many sites have really, really benefited from your intervention, the mention of Canterbury and Roach, just intriguing parallel evidence. Now, we do have some time for questions. And can I ask you to use a Q&A